Hello and welcome to the Food Research and Action Center webinar, Promoting Food Security, Strategic Response to Disasters and Household Misfortune. At this point, I'd now like to turn the floor over to our speakers with FRAC to begin.
Thank you so much. This is Ellen Bollinger, FRAC's Legal Director, and we appreciate those of you who are joining us to hear about leveraging nutrition assistance to help households and communities that have been hard hit by disaster. As you'll be hearing on this webinar, disasters can come in all shapes and sizes and causes, and impacts can be modest or they can be very severe, and they could be very broad, or it could be misfortune for one household. And we think that there are lessons learned about how the federal nutrition programs can be tailored to help meet the individual circumstances that come about because of those varied scenarios. Joining me today is DeAndre Jones here at FRAC, who is our Congressional Hunger Center Emerson Fellow and who's done much of the research for FRAC's publications around disaster relief. He will be presenting first on the webinar. He'll be providing us an overview on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, as well as Disaster SNAP and other federal nutrition program resources. He will be followed by Dawn Secor, who is the SNAP Policy Specialist for our statewide partner in New York State, Hunger Solutions New York. Dawn will be talking about SNAP replacements in a misfortune, and much of her talk will be about those rather small-scale but incredibly important situations for individual households where they have lost food, perhaps because of a power outage or some other misfortune, and ways that they can go about getting replacement benefits. And then we will hear from Natalie Jarow, who is President and CEO of Second Harvest Food Bank in New Orleans, and you will hear from her about disasters that have been varied but often quite large scale, and the work that she and the food bank have done in conjunction with the state agency and USDA resources to move commodities to disaster victims, as well as to get significant SNAP and DSNAP relief to those households. We have resources that we've just posted to our website, and we want to make sure that all of you see those available to you. These are publications that DeAndre has just finished for us. He's updated FRAC's Advocate Guide to the Disaster Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, better known as the DSNAP Guide. He's also produced for us a new policy brief on best practices for getting SNAP to disaster victims. We hope that you will take some time after this webinar to visit those resources, print them out, be ready and prepared if a disaster should hit, that you have some tools to refer to on looking at your options for policy responses to help people in your community. With that, I'm going to turn this over to DeAndre to give the SNAP overview. We will be holding questions until after the three presentations, but please do let us know through the chat room as questions come up, and we'll queue them in line. And again, thank you so much for joining us. DeAndre?
All right, thanks, Ellen. So as Ellen said, my name is DeAndre Jones, and I am a Congressional Hunger Fellow placed here at FRAC. A big thanks to everyone that's listening in right now, and a big thanks to our speakers for today. So I'm going to start with just a overview of the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, as it will be referred to a lot during this webinar. And first, I just want to cover three main points about SNAP. First is that SNAP is America's largest anti-hunger program. SNAP is funded through the USDA's Food Nutrition Services, or FNS, but it's administered by state agencies, and SNAP serves over 42 million people monthly. The second point is that SNAP is very, very responsive to the highs and lows of the American economy. Whenever we experience a food supply shock, such as a recession, a natural disaster, or a household misfortune, we see SNAP numbers expand to cover more people and to cover the shortage of income or the shortage of food in an area. Conversely, whenever food supply inflates or comes back to a normal point, we see SNAP contract and return back to its normal numbers. The third biggest point is that for each $1 of federally funded SNAP benefits, we see an economic multiplier of 1.79, meaning that every $1 generates $1.79 in economic revenue. So SNAP is good for the economy. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about serving SNAP households. So SNAP households may request replacement benefits on an individual basis for household misfortunes. And I'm not going to go too deep into this because our presenter directly after me, Don Secor, actually has a great discussion on this in part 2. States may request authority to issue replacement benefits for all ongoing SNAP households in zip code areas with power outages, and we call that mass auto replacement. Once again, another thing that I'm not going to go too deep on right now. And states may also request authority to issue supplemental benefits to bring the SNAP benefits to maximum benefit for household size in the event of a household misfortune. From there on, we're going to talk about disaster SNAP. So disaster SNAP is the primary disaster nutrition relief program in the United States. It can be run after a presidential authorization of individual assistance after a nationally declared disaster. And then the state must request authority from the USDA to run disaster SNAP. So disaster SNAP differs from SNAP mainly through its streamlined procedures, the first of which being that participants may deduct disaster-related damage or food loss from eligible income, meaning that households that typically might not be eligible for SNAP on a regular basis may become eligible for disaster SNAP due to lost food benefits or disaster to their home from or damages to their home from a disaster. Another example of streamlined procedures are that typically a DSNAP applicant will have heard back and have their application processed within 48 hours of applying for DSNAP. And DSNAP benefit periods typically only run for about a week. DSNAP extends benefits to households that are not already participating in SNAP, and that's a pretty important thing about disaster SNAP. Waivers allow replacement and supplemental benefits for SNAP households. And then our fantastic presenter, Natalie J. Rowe, will discuss DSNAP further in part 3 of this webinar. So connecting disaster victims with resources is a very, very vital part of disaster SNAP. And advocates can work with state agencies to get the word out on disaster SNAP and other available relief. This can happen through regular forms of media and social media, things like food resource fairs, and we actually wanted to highlight a really great app called the EBT Fresh app. That's a great tool to let SNAP households know about DSNAP and summer nutritional program sites. A little bit more about Fresh EBT. First of all, it's free. There's no fee to let an EBT cardholder know about emergency benefits. It has a really quick turnaround to learn about emergency benefits in a geographic area. And it has over 1 million downloads. So this is a possible great tool for people on EBT, especially after a disaster. So child nutrition and other program resources. So other federal nutrition programs besides disaster SNAP can also be tapped to serve disaster victims. And we actually have lengthy discussions on each of these programs: WIC, CACFP, the Summer Nutrition Program, school meals programs, and commodity distribution in the guide that Ellen mentioned earlier that we will provide links to after the webinar. But to go a little bit more in depth about child nutrition in disasters, if a household with children receives disaster SNAP or is certified as homeless, children are eligible for free school meals for the remainder of the school year and may apply for up to 30 days of free meals in the following school year. And we can already see how that's a very, very big resource to improve food security for a child that's lived through a disaster. The children can be directly certified for free school meals, but also can submit a school meal application to be certified. and the USDA can waive certain child nutrition program rules, such as meal pattern requirements, to ensure continued access to meals for these children. The USDA encourages state child nutrition agencies to prepare and plan before a disaster strikes so the response can be as swift as possible. And important opportunities for combating disaster-induced food security come through securing child nutrition and disasters. And that's actually going to conclude FRAC's portion of this webinar. So at this point, I'd like to pass it over to Dawn Sticker from Hunger Solutions New York.
Thank you so much, DeAndre. So I'm going to talk about SNAP replacement benefits and misfortune. And I just want to thank FRAC for inviting me to present today, and thank all of you for joining. Before we start, I just want to tell you a very little bit about Hunger Solutions New York. We're a statewide anti-hunger organization that works to increase awareness of, support for, and participation in federal nutrition assistance programs through collaboration with national, state, and local partners. This includes SNAP, school breakfast, school lunch program, summer food, and the child and adult care food program. We also manage programs to provide direct client assistance at the local level. We have the USDA FNS Outreach Grant for New York State for SNAP, and we have some other outreach, state-level outreach grants. We also serve as a program resource for individuals, organizations, and agencies, and we promote federal, state, and local policies that contribute to ending hunger. And one other thing I want to tell you that will help you better understand what I will be talking about is that in New York, we have a state-run county-administered SNAP program, so people must apply at the local county SNAP office, which determines eligibility and issues benefits to eligible households. And that's different than many of you that have state-run programs and can cause some other little wrinkles sometimes. So first I just wanted to talk about what I'm going to be talking about today is SNAP benefits, SNAP replacement benefits, the criteria and requirements of that. And I'll be highlighting the New York State rules around replacement, but I do want to encourage all of you to be talking with and looking at your state policies and to become familiar with the rules in your state, as there could be some slight differences. So SNAP has a special rule to help households who experience a food loss due to a misfortune. And on this slide, I have listed out what is defined as a misfortune in New York State. So the loss can be due to a situation that affects large areas, such as a power outage or flooding, or it can be specific to a single household, such as a fire, or even a failure to pay a utility bill and having the power turned off. And in New York State, the loss of power must last 4 hours or more in order for families to be eligible for replacement. So under the federal regulations, it is always possible for SNAP recipients who lose food in a household misfortune to obtain replacement benefits through the process that I've outlined here on this slide. So folks have to report the loss within 10 days of the misfortune and return a signed and completed state form within 10 days of reporting the loss. You have to remember, one important thing to remember is that SNAP households can use the replacement form to fulfill the requirement of both reporting the loss and submitting the form, instead of doing these two things separately. But in this case, the form has to be submitted within the 10 days of the loss. We encourage here in New York State, when we do outreach around this, we encourage folks to do this, but we also promote the full time frame for both reporting and sending in a form, so folks have a choice and understand the process and the time frames. Each time there is a severe storm here in New York, rain, sleet, ice, snow, we actually put a replacement toolkit up on our website. It's always there, but we just move it up our queue so that it is at the top And this includes information about replacement. So we have what we call our SNAP policy update. So there's an actual policy update about replacement benefits. There's a flyer for CBOs to share with their clients and other organizations. And we also have taken our state form and created a cover page that provides basic criteria, timeframes, and where to send the form, because our form, the state form, didn't have any of that information on it. In terms of the time frame that we were talking about, please note that if the 10th day for reporting or returning a form falls on a weekend or a holiday, then the 10-day deadline moves to the Monday or the day after the holiday. And you'll be able to see our New York State form and our cover page and the toolkit in a resource page I have coming up with links to these materials. I do want to talk a minute about extension of the 10 days to report. We've been successful in the past, and most recently back in March, in getting our state to extend the replacement time frame for reporting the loss when circumstances warrant this. So in the situation in March, there was a combination of a windstorm, which caused widespread, long-term, many days of power outages, and then a few days later, there was a blizzard. Lucky us that live in New York. So people actually had to leave their homes due to the long-term power outages and the severe weather conditions, freezing cold temperatures, the roads were closed. And all of this caused the SNAP office in the county to be closed for several days due to the blizzard. But in the meantime, the clock was ticking on that 10-day to report process. And we only had a couple of days left when all of this was going on with the blizzard. So as I told you, we have the SNAP Outreach Grant. And our folks on the ground, which are called NOAP, or Nutrition Outreach and Education Program Coordinators, alerted us and provided important details like the date of the offices being closed, both their own offices, their own agencies, and the SNAP office. The status of the power outage. So at that point, they were telling us there were over 500 homes still with no power. This was at the end of the 10 days to report the loss. And the situation they were seeing. So they had a backlog of calls from over 70-plus households and more calls coming every day, and they couldn't even get in their office. So we reached out to our state agency and asked them about an extension of the time frame to report the loss due to all the circumstances I just explained and described. And the state then had discussions with the county, and then they asked USDA for a waiver extension, and we were granted an additional 10 days for people to report. This allowed our NOAA coordinators to get the word out and return calls to and help over 300 households apply for replacement benefits. So it's definitely worth it, because those 300 households wouldn't have made it through that 10-day time frame gate if we hadn't asked for that extension. So that's just an example of sort of how it can work and what some best practices are. Here on this slide, I've provided some other kind of important details. So one thing is households should receive the replacement benefits within 2 business days of returning the signed and completed form. And the amount of the replacement benefit is determined based on each household's actual food loss and the time of the month that the misfortune occurs. And that's an important thing to remember. So replacement benefits can be issued up to the amount of the most recent SNAP benefit issuance to any household for that current month. But the later in the month the misfortune occurs, the lower the replacement amount may be. And that's all done by I'm pretty sure the state in New York is involved in that and works with the county on that. There is no limit on replacement. Folks just have to meet the criteria and follow the rules for reporting the loss and submitting the form. So like we have an expedited, or there's no limit, there's no special rules. You don't have to provide some kind of verification. Anytime a misfortune happens, you can request replacement. And as long as you fit the criteria and follow the rules, you should be eligible and receive that. And maybe only in New York, but our state has reminded SNAP offices that they cannot require people to bring in spoiled food as verification of a loss. And that usually tells me that some county has done this or asked to do this in the past. And of course, we all can easily understand why that would not be a good idea, right? So here are some resources that I have for all of you. With my last few minutes, if I have any, because I did not set my timer. So folks who are helping coordinate this tell me if I need to stop. I just wanted to highlight a few best practices we have learned. So one is get the word out early and often. SNAP offices usually don't advertise replacement. I think I already told you we use our website and we keep updating and putting at the top of the queue a post whenever there's a widespread event. We also use public service announcements, particularly with our NOVE coordinators on the ground. And it's a good way to get the word out and share information. Our NOVEs also, they also put together a plan for disaster or misfortunes, large-scale misfortunes, and give that to us each contract year. So that way we make them think about it before something happens. And that includes things like what Ellen said before, make sure you have your information and your form and your flyers and other things printed out in case you don't have access to your computer. If you can post information about replacement right before a storm, this can be very helpful. We learned this in Sandy. They were talking for several days, and the Sandy was going to hit over the weekend, and so we put something up. And we actually, when we put it up, and this is another best practice, is to use the name of the storm in your post. So we put something up saying, Superstorm Sandy and SNAP replacement. And that drove a ton of people to us, more than we expected or could handle initially, but we figured it out. And partially that was because down in New York City, there was the agencies weren't open, there was no electricity, and so we became it for a little while before things went back online in New York City. Share the form and info with community agencies when there is no emergency, right? So we have a SNAP guide, and I have it up here on the resource page that you can link to and look at. Part of that guide there's a section about replacement and DSNAP, and we have in the appendix the form with the cover page in the guide. A couple other just kind of very simple things, but it makes a huge difference. Make sure it's clear where to send the form. We learned this lesson during Sandy. Our state form did not say where to send it, and we didn't know that. But our cover page had our address on it. So people sent the form to us. And most of them we were able to get to the right place. And this is the other best practice, is make sure people know to write legibly and as carefully as they can so it can be read. And the last couple of things, it's important to make sure people understand that the state form is a legal statement indicating a loss of food due to a household misfortune and the cost of the lost food. And state or SNAP offices may use available information regarding power outages and flooding to confirm the accuracy of a household statement. So I think that is all that I have for you, and I am happy to answer questions at the end when we do that. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dawn. Now we're going to pass it over to Natalie Jairo from Second Harvest Food Bank of Southern Louisiana, an organization that's very close to my heart. Just like Dawn said, please do keep those questions coming. We are going to get to those at the end of the webinar. Natalie, we'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Ellen and DeAndre and the FRAC folks for including me on the call. I hope everyone can hear me. Okay. My story is going to be more of a story. of what has happened to us over the last little more than a decade, various events, and how we've responded to that and how our relationships with the state and most importantly SNAP and DSNAP have evolved as a result of the experiences that we've had and the challenges that we've had based on the type of experience. So bear with me a little bit as I tell our story. I'm the CEO of Second Harvest Food Bank of Greater New Orleans and Acadiana. We feed South Louisiana. So we stretch all the way from the Mississippi to the Texas borders. This kind of gives you an idea of our 500 plus. This is representation of our 500 plus partner organizations. So what we try to focus on is that we're very, very grassroots oriented, and we try to ensure that everything we do is responsive to a particular neighborhood or parish. And this is no more important than when we're in disaster response, as we've seen through the last more than a decade. The type of response that you need to do is very, very different in an urban area from more rural areas. The challenges that are presented are different from disaster to disaster, and those will come up as we talk a little bit about what has been going on in Louisiana, South Louisiana. We were actually founded in the aftermath of some major hurricanes as the Archdiocese of New Orleans realized that we had to get a whole lot better at responding quickly to people's needs. So disaster response from the days of the late 60s with Betsy, et cetera, was always a part of what we did. This is something we talk a lot about in the food bank world because not every food bank considers themselves a responder. I would say everyone is, and I think it's already been pointed out that SNAP is available for the disaster of a single person struggling with hunger or an entire community. We very much use that mantra that this is all scalable for us. It can be an economic disaster. And we're just scaling our response to the neighborhood and organization as we need to based on the disaster. One of the things that has happened over the last more than a decade is that our relationship with the state and the federal government and many agencies has deepened considerably as we've gone through several iterations of what it's like to work through a large-scale disaster. So we work closely with the Governor's Office of Homeland Security here. Everyone has their version in their state. We work closely with Agriculture and Forestry that, of course, is responsible for the TFEP. Deandra pointed out the many ways that the federal government steps in with nutrition assistance after a disaster. We work with the Department of Children and Family Services. We do the SNAP outreach here in the state of Louisiana. And that's all important because when a disaster comes, each one is different. The state always has to vary their response based on what's actually happening, whether or not an emergency declaration has been declared by the federal government. Then they have to deal with what the power outages look like, what the road closures look like. And that always means that there are decisions that are made on the spot in terms of response. And that goes for the nutrition programs as well. And it's really, really important to think of that because, as I was listening to Deandre, we work directly with USDA who comes into the food bank or somewhere else, our regional office, whenever a disaster strikes, and they look at the whole repertoire of federal benefits, nutrition benefits that are available, and they decide based on that disaster which ones they're going to offer to a community. But because of the way that the Stafford Act, which determines the FEMA disaster response, because of the way that's written, it's very, very difficult to offer multiple types of federal nutrition assistance at one time after a disaster. And as we go through what's happened to us, I'll show you how that can really impact what happens to the individual in the community that's affected. This is just more about flexibility and responsiveness, and I'm kind of saying this already. No two disasters are the same. we have a very strong internal disaster plan here, which includes our communicating with the state or the parish emergency management or whatever neighborhoods or communities are going to be affected. And to use Louisiana as an example, we've had Katrina and Rita, which covered the entire southern part of the state. We had Gustav and Ike, which went up the middle of the state. We had the oil spill, which covered the parishes on the Gulf Coast primarily. We've most recently had the floods in Baton Rouge over August that really took a lot of people by surprise and flooded many, many homes that weren't in a floodplain. And we had tornadoes that we responded to here in New Orleans. All of those were responded to differently by the state, and part of our emergency plan is to make those connections. If it's a hurricane or some kind of storm we can see coming in advance, we certainly try to make sure all those resources are available to the people that we serve in advance. If not, we're on the phone and in meetings with FEMA, the state, and USDA regionally to respond as quickly as we can to whatever situation arises. After Katrina and Rita, we became the largest food bank in the world. At that time, that wasn't us, that was the entire country and world coming together. That was really, really important because I think that for our state, that was the realization that government can be truly overwhelmed in a large-scale disaster, and that the other advocates and anti-hunger partners that they have, the nonprofits, have to be front and center in their own disaster planning. And that's made it much easier for us to partner going forward. I mentioned a little bit that USDA comes in after a large-scale disaster. They take a look and decide whether or not they're going to open Disaster SNAP to people, whether or not they're going to make commodities available because they believe people have been forced out of their homes and therefore the stores are not going to be available and people aren't going to be able to use that Disaster SNAP. They'll give us permission to take those school commodities and use them in our emergency food response post-disaster, but they don't normally do more than one of these emergency responses at a time. So as in the case of the floods, we can have an entire community that's in the shelter and needs those disaster commodities that come through the American Red Cross and the other shelter providers. And at the same time, people further out from the flooding really could use the Disaster SNAP, but they can't get it at the same time. I'm giving you that as kind of a challenge that we face based on, you know, what has actually happened the way the law is currently written. I talked about the 4 disasters. We've already, in the last 14 months, we distributed 1.7 million pounds of food, water, and disaster supplies. And by the way, this is primarily about Disaster SNAP, but some of the other ways we partner with government is with the MREs that the state typically stores up against any disaster response, especially in states like ours where we have an active hurricane season. When a situation like the floods in Baton Rouge that occurred over this last year occurs, and we start to talk with FEMA, with USDA, and with the state, what we look at is all of the supplies and all of the techniques that the state has to respond. And in some cases, that means the meals ready to eat that are stored by the National Guard against this type of disaster response. So to give you an example of what happened in the August floods, we were actually delivering meals ready to eat donated by the federal government to the hotels where people were staying because they had been forced out of their homes in the Baton Rouge area. And to also use the floods as an example, and there are even better ones, Disaster SNAP was very difficult in that particular disaster to come by. The state's ability to respond and their staff on the ground is going to determine how quickly they make these DSNAP benefits available to people that are affected. So to give you an example, after the August floods, because DSNAP had limited ability to actually work with people on Disaster SNAP, they were opening Disaster SNAP parish by parish and alphabetically. So if you had a last name beginning with A, you could only apply for Disaster SNAP on certain days of the week, and then you were closed out. And then people whose last name started with a different letter could apply for on different days of the week. If you think about that and the kind of consequences that has for people who need the help right now, and that kind of gives you an idea of what can happen in a disaster. The plans are great, but again, every disaster is different, and everyone has to have the ability to respond, and there's generally a hiccup in the system somewhere. And so we're constantly trying to figure out how we can work around those hiccups to get people the help they need. DSNAP obviously was called Disaster Food Stamps. We talked about that being available. During Hurricanes Gustav and Ike, we had tremendous problems with DSNAP in this community. That particular storm went up the middle of the state and knocked out power for several weeks. The state attempted, and USDA gave them permission to open up DSNAP. Their facilities for registering people for DSNAP were immediately overwhelmed, and they shut down. There were chances that there were going to be food riots. You know, our trucks going into neighborhoods at that time were actually commandeered by the National Guard because they were concerned that order had broken down so much over this food and water. The state was completely unprepared to take the volume of people that were going to need the DSNAP help over that time. That's what happened. And as a result of Hurricanes Gustav and Ike, here in the state of Louisiana, they implemented the pre-application for Disaster SNAP, which can happen at the beginning of every hurricane season now. So people in Louisiana are actually encouraged to pre-apply for Disaster SNAP. Here's the challenge with that. They can pre-apply, but it still doesn't get them Disaster SNAP when a disaster hits. They still have to go through the interview with the Department of Children and Family Services. So depending on how the state is staffed up and how prepared they are to take those interviews is going to determine how fast DSNAP becomes available to people that are affected by a major storm. We had an all-paper process, so certainly the pre-application makes things a lot better than it was. And this talks about the online phone pre-application. And by the way, while that came to Louisiana for DSNAP first, it was also quickly applied to regular SNAP. And so now our team members work with people to help them through the SNAP application process, which can be electronic. So that's been a major gain for the state in terms of how we provide nutrition assistance. And after Hurricane Isaac, we distributed $104 million in DSNAP benefits across 21 parishes. DSNAP eligibility it varies depending on the type of disaster, and they're not pre-announced. Again, they're a great benefit, but there is always that period of time where we determine whether DSNAP is going to be offered and what the conditions are, and then that creates additional confusion for folks who are not only applying for food benefits, but are also applying for other types of federal benefits if they've been affected by a major disaster. So the reporting that you've heard discussed, that can become problematic when you're applying for an SBA loan to rebuild your house and you're getting Disaster SNAP. There's always the question of whether regular SNAP, people receiving regular SNAP are eligible for Disaster SNAP or whether their benefits will continue, and they do. There's always confusion. And then there are, of course, transportation barriers to getting to those DSNAP sites. So if you have a major disaster that's affected a broad area, and that includes rural areas, opening up Disaster SNAP does not necessarily mean that people are going to have are going to be able to access that Disaster SNAP. So that's when we work with the government to try to get those school commodities, to try to do our standard food bank distribution, to try to get the the neighborhood organizations that we support to try to get them enough food to take care of people in those parishes, because it's never just as simple as opening up the program and having everyone that is eligible actually access benefit in 48 hours. It doesn't happen that way. So I think I'll stop there. I apologize if this was a lot of information, but I kind of wanted to give you all a feel for what happens in practice in a major scale disaster. DSNAP and SNAP, there's nothing, they are by far the greatest tools we have for nutrition challenges in disaster. We just try to make sure we're filling the gaps. And that's it.
Thanks, Natalie, so much. That was a very informational presentation. At this point, we're going to go into some Q&A. We do have some great questions already, but please, if you are listening to this webinar and you have a question, please do ask it. We have a little over 15 minutes, so we're just going to answer questions until we run out. The first question that we have is, can you give us an example of a mass auto replacement? And I can actually take this one. For those that don't know what we're talking about, a little bit earlier in the first part of the webinar, we mentioned mass auto replacement, which is actually a SNAP waiver requested from the USDA by a state that is specifically for people that are already receiving SNAP. And so we saw this in North Carolina. So following Hurricane Matthew's landfall in October of 2016. North Carolina obtained a waiver to automatically replace 50% of a month's worth of benefits for all SNAP recipients in select affected counties by Hurricane Matthew. And the cool part about mass auto replacement is that these benefits were simply posted to each recipient's EBT card with no special action required by the client. So no going to an office, no request, no application. If you lived in the zip code or in this affected area and you had an EBT card, your benefits were automatically replaced. And so that's the big benefit to mass auto replacement. Moving on to the next question, we have a great question from Alexandra Kaufman, and it's, what would it take for the president to declare an emergency and give a presidential authorization of individual assistance? And what are some recent disaster examples? She brings up Superstorm Sandy. So I think I'll pass this one to Ellen here at FRAC to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The predicate for a presidential declaration is first that the state's governor has made some assessment that this is a major disaster and requests that the president do it. And there is information on the FEMA website about some of the kind of assessment that would go on from the federal government level to decide whether or not the president, who has the discretion to do this, whether the president will go ahead and declare that a disaster or not. Much of that assessment has to do with the extent of the disaster, its impact on individuals and public facilities, and the types of federal assistance that might be needed. And they're going to be very interested in seeing that the disaster is of a severity and magnitude such that the effective response is likely beyond the capabilities of the state and local governments themselves. That being said, the examples of situations in which DSNAP has followed a presidential disaster declaration range from all kinds of incidents. Flooding is a very common one. Power outages, whether associated with floods or not, some of those are caused by hurricanes. They may be caused by tornadoes and other things. Fires can give rise to this. So it's not so much the source of the disaster as the impact and the scope, and that's what the federal government would be looking at for that.
Thanks, Ellen.
Ellen, could I jump in?
Yes, please.
There are also types of disasters that are not eligible for federal disaster declaration, and the example we have is the oil spill. So there are some instances where the cause of the disaster makes a difference. The oil spill was not covered by the Stafford Act. It was covered by the Oil Pollution Act, which meant that the corporation responsible for what happened in the Gulf was completely on the hook for all benefits. Meant disaster SNAP was not going to become available. But even in that situation, our relationships that we built over time with the state helped. That's when we were able to get categorical eligibility for our regular SNAP, and that was the way we could make that program work for people in the southern part of the state affected by that particular incident.
Thanks, Natalie. And the next question is along the same lines within disaster SNAP. So a question from Andrew. He wants to know what happens during a disaster that would make an entire county uninhabitable. He gives uninhabitable. He gives an example from California where they had a dam failure that essentially flooded out a whole county. Ellen, if you want to start on that, and then maybe a comment from Natalie afterwards.
Yeah, I would just mention that we were not that familiar with the idea of evacuees and DSNAP until Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and of course there was massive evacuations from the affected areas, and those evacuees were scattered around the country and were out of their home area for many months, and it's one of the few examples we have of USDA developing policy for DSNAP that deals specifically with the needs of evacuees, and in that circumstance, because of the severity, people were afforded DSNAP benefits where they were located, and in duration, they were given benefits for 3 months because of the severity of the situation. I know that, Natalie, more recently in Louisiana, the severity of the disaster with floodings last year did give rise to an unusual DSNAP in which people who were affected received 2 months of benefits. But I wondered, since you have so much experience with evacuations in Louisiana, if you would like to add something about some of the particular challenges you see for serving and getting served people who are in an evacuation status.
So, in a sense, thank you, Ellen. In a sense, this is what I was kind of inarticulately trying to say prior to this, that our experience in these large-scale disasters and in disasters where one county or parish, as we call them, becomes uninhabitable while another parish may be somewhat affected, but we still have people living in their homes, perhaps isolated. This is really a challenge. As Ellen mentioned, the great news for Disaster SNAP is that we were able to get it extended over a period of time. But people didn't know that their benefits were going to be extended. So that had to happen periodically, where the governor would go back to the federal government and ask for additional time for people to receive Disaster SNAP based on the fact that the situation was much worse than they thought it was going to be, and people were not able to get back into their homes. There was a large evacuee population. One of our challenges is, as I mentioned, is that at the same time there are people in the parishes or counties that are surrounding the epicenter of the disaster who may be isolated in their homes. They're not necessarily eligible for Disaster SNAP, but they still need some type of response. So typically what will happen in a disaster like this is that we'll work directly with FEMA to try to find a way to make the federal law work so that we can get federal commodities like those school commodities and get them into those outlying parishes. The challenge is to always run different kinds of response at the same time.
Thanks, Natalie. So Dawn is... Go ahead, Natalie.
I was just going to quickly mention one more thing, and this is particular to Louisiana, just that because of the Hurricane Katrina and Rita situation, there is a psychological impact on people whenever any kind of storm or major disaster is threatening. And that really does affect how we interact with people in terms of disaster response.
Thanks, Natalie. And so, Dawn, this next question is going to be pointed towards you. We have someone asking if they can receive emergency SNAP the same day in New York.
I know the federal rule is that they have to, folks would get it within 2 days of providing that signed form. I can't say that it's never happened quicker. What I can say is that offices quickly get overwhelmed, even in replacement, which is very different than disaster. Usually with replacement and misfortune, what I was talking about, there is not a DSNAP being called, or it's prior to a DSNAP being called. And so this is only, replacement is only for people currently participating in SNAP. And so offices, like in the situation I was telling you about back in March, you know, the SNAP office had been closed for several days due to the blizzard. They were handling applications as they came in, but there might have been a moment where they had to kind of catch up. So.
Thanks, Dawn, so much. So we received a question asking for a brief description of the difference between disaster SNAP and replacement benefits, and this is one that I can actually answer. The difference lies in whether or not a household is already receiving SNAP when a disaster hits. DSNAP is only for people who are not already on SNAP before the disaster hits. DSNAP is meant to serve people specifically in response to a disaster that do not have SNAP. Replacement benefits are what people that are on SNAP prior to a disaster receive through a series of waivers like the mass auto replacement that I just mentioned. So our next question is, are there any response best practices on how to address populations with special dietary needs in relation to a medical condition and evacuation situations, like dialysis, food, and tank? Natalie, do you have any perspective on this?
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. So, of course, the government is in charge of disaster response first and foremost, meaning the National Guard. So the first line of attack or the first line of response is going to be the federal government and National Guard. They always have, as part of their plans, how they're going to cover people with special dietary needs. You know, because obviously if people have special dietary needs, they may also be in a position where disaster SNAP is not going to be a solution for them, where they don't have the ability to get to stores and actually provide food for themselves. So in cases of a mass disaster where a number of people and medically frail people are being affected, the government is the first responder. We hear a lot of those stories, so then the advocates definitely have a role, and we usually talk directly with FEMA, directly with GOSEP, and what we hear in our outlying parishes about people with special dietary needs that aren't able to get those needs fulfilled with the standard federal nutrition programs. And then we try to access that food through our charitable system.
Thanks, Natalie. And you can actually answer this next one as well. Are instances of DSNAP pre-apps utilization limited to coastal areas, or is it a nationwide program?
Nationwide program. We've just had a lot of opportunity to use it, but no, it's nationwide. Oh, now, pre-apps, that's a state-by-state decision. Louisiana does the pre-apps because they learn through tough experience with disasters that getting a jump on that process was going to help us to be able to respond. So other folks on this call will know what other states do. This is a state-by-state decision.
Let's not ask that one.
Thanks, Natalie. So we got a question in referring to giving an example of a resource fair, which was also mentioned earlier in the webinar during the FRAC portion. This is actually an example that we highlighted in the best practice guide that Ellen talked a little bit about, but it refers to Somerset County in Maryland after being hit really hard by Hurricane Sandy. The federal government initially turned down a request for DSNAP, but after some advocacy on the part of the congressional delegation of Maryland, as well as Maryland Hunger Solutions, a really great org, that decision got reversed. And once that declaration was secured, efforts to highlight the availability of DSNAP benefits included a visit to the affected area by Senator Ben Cardin and a quote-unquote food resource day, which is this resource fair that we're talking about, which is sponsored by Maryland Hunger Solutions, AARP of Maryland, Maryland Food Bank, and the Maryland Department of Human Resources. And during this event, groups provided DSNAP information and application assistance. And so thanks everyone for your great questions. We're actually gonna, we're out of time here, so we're gonna close down the webinar, but thank you to Dawn and to Natalie for presenting on this webinar. Thank you, Ellen. And thanks to everyone that tuned in. We are going to send out links to the 2 resources that we talked about, the Disaster SNAP Best Practice and the Advocate's Guide to Response to Disaster SNAP, both posted by FRAC in the last week. Once again, thanks to everyone. And that is the conclusion of this webinar.
On behalf, on behalf of the Food and Research and Action Center, I'd like to thank you all for joining today and for your participation, as well as your excellent questions. I'd also like to thank Dawn and Natalie for their excellent presentations today. At this point, audience members, you should now see a survey live on your screen. If you could please help fill this out, it does improve our future webinars, and we certainly do appreciate any feedback that you can provide. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that you all have a great rest of your day, and this does conclude today's session.